Welcome to this week's Bhagavad Gita discourse. We're going to continue this week with chapter 6, and Krishna has been speaking about how the yogi acts, how the yogi behaves, how the yogi meditates, and is giving advice in this chapter to Arjuna, telling him how to be seated and so forth. And Krishna goes on with stanza number 12. He says to Arjuna, seated firmly there, meaning there on his asana, with one pointed concentration of the mind, and neither roaming mentally nor reacting to sense stimuli, let him seek self-purification by yoga practice. Holding the spine, neck, and head firmly erect and motionless, let the yogi focus his gaze at the starting point of the nose, the nasikagram, between the two eyebrows, and let him not gaze elsewhere, but keep his gaze calmly one-pointed. And we see in this stanza, these two stanzas, that Krishna is giving very explicit instructions to Arjuna of how to go about meditation. And this is exactly the same teachings that we also teach similarly in the practice of Kriya Yoga and the teachings of these great masters, Paramahansa Yogananda and our line of gurus. And particularly I'll call our attention to that second stanza where he speaks about keeping the attention firmly placed at the point between the eyebrows. And he mentions the word the nasikagram. And I've heard it said, I know Swami Kriyananda used to say that some translators translate that point to be here, the point of the nose, and they advise people to meditate there, focusing on the point of the nose. But you could see from your own personal practice, if you do that, what is going to happen. Your eyes are downwardly focused, and here, if you're focusing here at the point between the eyebrows, or even at the point between the nose, pretty soon you find your consciousness going down. And it's not appropriate at all. And I think anybody who has some experience of meditation knows that the eyes need to be focused upward, and that this word nasikagram is translated as the origin of the nose, not the tip of the nose. And that origin of the nose is here at the point between the eyebrows. Now, in these teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda and of the masters of Kriya Yoga, this point between the eyebrows, this nasikagram position in the body, it's mentioned often. I think I've been practicing these techniques now for over 4 decades, and I've just taken it for granted. This is the natural approach to meditation and how we should approach our yoga practice, by keeping our attention there. Paramahansa Yogananda used to say that if you can learn to keep your attention inwardly focused at the point between the eyebrows for a complete day, uninterrupted, 24 hours, that you very soon reach a state of self-realization. Well, hearing that, of course, I said, oh, that's for me, and I began to try that, but it's not quite so easy to do. The mind, as you know, anybody who has meditated, the mind very quickly wanders and goes here, goes there, goes elsewhere. But yet, you might try that just in the midst of your working day, in the midst of whatever you're doing, whatever outward activity your duties take you to. Just try to act from that point, from this spot between the eyebrows, this frontal lobe of the brain, and feel as if that is your seat. Your mental asana is there at that third eye. Now, as I said, I used to simply just take this for granted as a teaching that is broadly shared throughout the yoga tradition. But then as I began to learn more and began to explore what other people taught, I began to see that this is something not, I wouldn't say unique to our path, because this is a broad teaching. Here we see Krishna himself in the Gita saying that, but not every meditation tradition emphasizes that. You find mindfulness meditation just is more sort of watching one's thoughts, or perhaps just watching the breath. But how many, you might say, overlook this important point of keeping one's focus there? And it's something of a characteristic of the Kriya path. And noticing that, I began to wonder why that would be. Why is it such an important point? Well, of course, just physiologically, we can see that this point here, the point between the eyebrows, correlates with the frontal lobe of the brain. We see that in humans, as compared to lower animals, we see that this brain, and this frontal lobe of the brain, is what distinguishes us as a species, separates us from the animals. And you can see the lower animals, and say a dog, for instance, his brow there's no brow there, just his head, skull goes back, and there's very little there. And what this indicates physiologically is that this is the higher centers of the brain. And this is, of course, what physiologists and scientists say, that this is the part of the brain that has evolved most recently to give us these human characteristics. And that part of the brain gives us those higher faculties that make us human. And so consequently, when we put our attention there, when we focus our attention there, wherever our attention is, there's a certain amount of direction of life forces being channeled to the point where we put our attention. Think of the energization exercises that Paramahansa Yogananda taught, and we teach in the yoga tradition. We talk about tense with will, relax and feel with individual body parts. We send life force consciously. We're sending life force and using the muscles in those exercises. By tensing, we're making ourselves aware of that particular muscle and then feeling as if we're directing life force there. But the tensing is not the necessary part. It helps us, but what the important point is to the awareness of that body part, and then allowing us, through being aware of that body part, to consciously send life force to that body part. So you could say that when we're aware of the point between the eyebrows, that that's our physical seat of our sense of self within the body, we're also sending life force to that part of the brain, and we're, you might say, lighting it up, enlightening in that part of the brain, and drawing life force perhaps away from other parts of the brain, which might be more of a primitive side of the brain. There's a contest, you might say, between different parts of the physical brain. The limbic system deep in the brain, that part of the brain that controls the very fundamental responses or reactions that we have when something comes into our world and we're frightened or fear, and we react, and we don't have to think about it. Fire, comes, and all of a sudden we just instinctively react to it and try to put it out or get away from it. Danger, these types of things. And that reactive part of the brain, that emotionally reactive part of the brain particularly, is deep inside. And what we're doing, you could say, is we're transferring the life force from that part of the brain up toward that frontal part of the brain, which is more that part which allows us to respond and in an appropriate way to whatever situation we have in life. It's a response part of the brain as opposed to a reactive part of the brain. And what is the difference between responding and reacting? Well, response implies consideration. We consider what is the right thing to do, what's the useful thing to do, what works. And so that part of the brain that you might say considers what the input of the senses, that intellect part of the brain, that part that discriminates. And that too is said, buddhi, intellect, is said to be seated here in the frontal part of the brain. It's the point also of concentration, is located here in the frontal part of the brain. So these, you could see, just by focusing on that part of the brain, we energize it, we stimulate it, and we enhance that part of the brain. It's also, in the yogic science, of course, we know that this part of the brain is also associated with the sixth chakra, the Agya chakra. This point between the eyebrows is said to be the positive pole of the Agya chakra, where the negative chakra point of that chakra is here in the medulla oblongata. And yoga science explains that the seat of intellect here is in the point between the eyebrows, seat of concentration, but here in the medulla oblongata is said to be the seat of ego, ahankar, is located there. And you can see that. Biologically, it's from the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, that these autonomic parts of our nervous system are directed from there. It controls the heart and the breath. And it's said at this point the life force actually enters into the body at that point. And so yogis say that it's at the medulla that the ego resides, in our seat of consciousness, to the degree that we are identified with this body and we have an ego and we're identified with that ego, that is resides there at the medulla oblongata. Our seat of consciousness is from there. The embodied soul, you could say, has a sense of I-ness. That I, where does that I reside? I am. Well, we don't think of ourselves as residing so much in the torso, or perhaps maybe some people do think of themselves in the stomach. But some people, you could say, our sense of I might be here in the heart, but it's right here in the medulla oblongata, that's center that's associated with the breath and the heartbeat. Now, yoga says, teachings of yoga say, the process of self-realization is one of learning to transfer our sense of I from the medulla oblongata from its negative pole in the Agya chakra to its positive pole here at the point between the eyebrows. And so when we meditate, you can actually think of yourself as sitting there at the medulla oblongata, gazing upward toward the spiritual eye and gazing there. And as we gaze and focus upon that point, we begin to transfer our awareness there. And that eventually, when we're able to still the breath, calm the breath, perhaps even, I might say, go breathless, go beyond the breath, we begin to transfer our sense of self to that higher center here at the point between the eyebrows. Also, we know, and you can find this to be true from your own personal experience of meditation, that when you focus your attention calmly, joyfully at the point between the eyebrows, you'll begin to, in a deeper state, you begin to see light there at that point between the eyebrows. It'll have a illumination, and this is said in mystical tradition to be the place where we see the third eye. The third eye being that inner experience, visual experience that's transcendental and universal. Universal in the sense that it doesn't matter if you're Indian, Australian, South African, American. We all see these lights very similarly. It's not culturally produced. And there's a particular light that's associated with very deep state of meditation that's known as the spiritual eye. And this is a field of blue light seen very distinctly and very clearly. And that field of blue light is surrounded by a ring of golden light. And if one is very, very, might say, deep in their meditation, their perception of that light there, in the middle of that gold field, one will see a small white light seen clearly. It's in the shape of a 5-pointed star. Now, this experience of seeing this light is something that, as I said, is cross-cultural. It's part of how we are made. When the devotee goes deep within, what is happening is we're withdrawing that life force away from the senses. To the degree that the life force that is in the senses, it disturbs the mind, and we're not able to see that light clearly, or if at all. But once we withdraw that life force away from the senses into the deep spine, we begin to illuminate that inner spine, and that's that projection of that inner spine is what we see in the third eye. And it's the meditator who concentrates upon that light. And if you ever do see that light, gaze upon that light reverentially, because it's a holy vision to see that. Gaze reverentially upon that in devotional awe, you might say, and try to penetrate your consciousness into that light, merge into that light. And so by concentrating here, keeping our attention here at the point between the eyebrows, we naturally, through concentration, begin to draw our life force away from the senses, but also through stimulation, we begin to enhance that. Now, when I say here at the point between the eyebrows, be careful with the physical eyes. If the physical eyes try to look at that point, you might become cross-eyed a little bit. And this is why when we teach people to meditate in the beginning stages, we say, rather than trying to look here, put your thumb out in the distance away from you and look an arm's length away, slightly above the horizon, and gaze there. And then it's very gentle, it's very natural, and there won't be physical stress. You'll find actually that when you begin to interiorize through deep meditation, the eyes very naturally will go upward. This is why you see in pictures of saints from traditions east and west, when they're in a state of ecstasy, usually their eyes are uplifted in that way, because it's just naturally that pull of that inner light, that inner welling of life force at that point pulls the body physically, the eyes in this case, to that point. And so this also is a reason why we concentrate on that point between the eyebrows, by physically looking at that point. In the Western tradition, there's this point is called the Star of the East, and it's said that this is the deeper meaning in the Bible when the three wise men saw the Star of the East, and they followed that star to the baby Jesus, the birth of Christ consciousness, you might say. So very symbolic in that sense. We look into that Star of the East in order to awaken, give birth to that Christ consciousness. And so this is a part of the yogic tradition. Now there's these stanzas that we've been studying over the last few weeks, talking about how the yogi should sit, how he should prepare his asana, how he should hold his body, keeping the spine erect and gazing upward and focusing his concentration there. All of these are these outward postures, you might say, outward practices are good guidance, but they have a larger point is being made with them, and I'd like to address just in a broader sense something that Krishna is saying here. And the broader issue is whatever we do outward, whatever, let's say in this case, whatever posture we assume outward, and I'm meaning this more than just physical posture, but whatever outward expression that we have in life, how we hold ourselves, what we do, how we behave, all of these things are, you might say, an expression of our inward state of consciousness. And you can see this, a person has a certain inward state of consciousness, and they will often express it in a way that they hold their body posture, you might say in this case, or how their facial expressions might be. You can tell when a person's angry, their face contorts in a certain way. When a person is happy, it's in another way. All emotions and states of consciousness have to some degree an outward physical expression. Now, we see this in ourselves, and we can see it. It's common knowledge. We recognize that, and we begin to react to people or respond to people according to their body language, you might say. Well, if this is so, then perhaps we can turn that around and also say, or ask the question, can we affect our inward state of consciousness and what we're trying to achieve inwardly by the proper manipulation and use of our body language, or the proper outward expression? If we change that, can we somehow inwardly begin to affect our inner state of consciousness, our inner moods? And the answer is yes, we can. Now, it doesn't mean we will, but it means that we can. There's the possibility of that we can actually do that. Now, take for example, simply your physical posture. If you're feeling a little bit low, you're feeling lazy, things aren't going right, you just wake up you'd have one of those days when life is somewhat blah. You don't feel energetic. You change your physical posture. You sit up and you inhale and you tense and you just say yes. And you consciously do this, even though inwardly you don't feel it. You just consciously affirm that through your physical posture, and you begin to you will see that if you put attention and will, and maybe even more important than willingness to cooperate with what you're trying to achieve, you can change your mood. And so, for example, a very good exercise is if you are feeling lazy or low or unenergetic, is just to stand up very straight and then bend forward, down, and then raise up, and is like in full yogic breath, but in this case, raise the arms up, tensing the body as you tense up, and lift up as you inhale with a full breath, and tense the whole body as you're standing with your arms up, lifting, and then exhale and release and go down. And do this again 2, 3, 4 times, and you'll find that this simple movement with tension, pulling yourself up and then tensing, will have an effect of very subtly lifting the physical life force, the physical energy within the body, which begins to have an impact on the inner life force itself, and your moods and your feelings and your inner attitudes begin to follow along with that. Now, the more you train yourself to be able to do that, the better you'll be at it. But the principle is using the outward to be able to affect the inward. And this is the principle behind yoga postures. Each yoga posture stimulates the body physically in a certain way to produce a certain mood or attitude. And if we cooperate with that, we can see that very quickly we can begin to change. Now, these are individual practices, but the larger principle applies. And that larger principle is, it matters in life what we physically outwardly do. The outward action of a devotee is a reflection of what's going on inside in their consciousness. But yet, the opposite is also true. What we do outwardly can affect our inner consciousness. And if we know that, we then can begin to approach life in a very conscious way, to consciously change ourselves. Now, the implication is here, on a deeper level, that is it possible, I would ask, I don't know the answer if it's been proven physiologically or not, and I don't know enough, but is it possible to even change ourselves on the biological, physical, physiological level, to actually, just by our outer choice of actions, how we behave, to actually create and stimulate responses chemically, hormonally, and actually structurally inside in the body? I believe that to be true, and I believe people anecdotally certainly have demonstrated that to be true, that the outer can affect the inner. An interesting example was brought up to me just yesterday. I was speaking with a doctor, psychologist, and we were talking about multiple personality syndrome, a topic that I've raised in other classes at one time or another, giving various examples. And she shared another example with me that which was from her personal experience, because she had some experience with people suffering from multiple personality disorder. And she was saying to me that one interesting case that she had, or had association with, was a person who in one personality was healthy in a normal way, but in the other personality was diabetic. Yes, diabetic, and so consequently needing insulin shots and all of the various physical things that go with treating one's diabetes. But yet, when her personality would change to the other, there would be no diabetes. Now, what do we make of that? I can't explain it, how that is, but it seems as if our physical body seems to be a reflection of some sort of energy pattern. You might say that there's a template, an energy template of perhaps the movement of energies moving in a certain way as the blueprint for any, like an architect makes a blueprint before a physical building is created. So somehow we have a physical blueprint that manifests the physical body in some way. Well, can we change the blueprint, you might say, of our own physical body? And that seems to be some implication that yes, the blueprint itself is not immutable. The blueprint itself is based upon what? Something even deeper. That astral body, of which the blueprint would be a symbol of, is not who we really are also. There's something beyond that. There's this causal body of thought and attitudes that influences. And you find that if we can change ourselves on some level, on that deeper level, we can actually change the expression of those thoughts and attitudes. And so this opens up a whole area of potential for us. And of course, if we've studied these teachings, in our Raja Yoga classes, we touch on this when we speak about affirmations. Affirmation is trying to actually, on a very, very deep level, change that mental pattern that gives rise to that energy blueprint of what the body is actually then, or an expression of. Now, I remember when this topic of outwardly, if we can change who we are and what we are outwardly, and certainly we know we can do that, and having an effect upon ourselves inwardly. When I was a boy growing up, probably I was a teenager, early teenager, I remember my mother used to, like most mothers do for their sons and daughters, sons maybe more than daughters, she tried to get me to comb my hair and present myself nicely, and when I go off to school, I had to be in a certain way, and my clothes were clean, and all of it as you normally do. So by the time I was a teenager, I was a little bit rebellious about this, and so she would do her duty, you might say, and try to get me to change my ways or improve my ways, because I tended not to dress all that well, and it was rather casual, let's say, in the way I dressed. And so she would say, no, you need to change. She says, and she would always use this phrase. She would say, remember, Johnny, clothes make the man. Clothes make the man. And in other words, she was saying, if you want to be dignified, if you want to be successful in life, if you want to accomplish what you have to accomplish, you need to project that. And in her case, she was using this example, so you need to dress appropriately, and you'll be taken seriously, and you'll find yourself successful in life. And all of this very good motherly advice. Well, it was actually, it was true. There's a lot of truth to what she said. But at that age, I was rebellious, and I didn't want to accept that. And my response to her, and mentally, if I didn't say it, was that, that's hypocritical. I am who I am, and whether I wear clothing that has spots on it or rips in it or whatever, what does it matter? I want to be my true self, and what does it matter what my clothing is? I'm still me inside. And so I was thinking that way. So I says, I'm not going to bother with that. And so I was a little rebellious. And but as time has gone by, I began to realize that actually my mother was right in a lot of ways. Parents normally are, usually. And I began to see that, well, there was a point there. And Not that we should wear something outwardly in order to fool somebody else, because I was saying, well, that's hypocritical. We should be who we are, and not bother about the externals. Now, there's a certain high-mindedness sound to that, and there's some truth to that too, because if we try to just change the outer in order to fool somebody, like we say, well, why should I behave nice to somebody else when I'm actually angry at them? Why should I be polite to somebody that I don't like? Why should I smile when I'm feeling disgusted or something like that? And we often say, well, because if I do that, I'm not being true to myself. I'm not being honest. Well, as I've been thinking, studying yoga, I've asked the question, who are we anyway? Am I really that person who, let's say, why should I smile if I'm actually angry? Is that really my true self, the angry me? That's no more angry than the other. Each of them is as you might say, each of them is like clothing that I have chosen to wear. Just as my mother was saying, clothing makes the man. Wear that clothing and you'll give a good impression to other people. And I may have rejected that, but yet I chose to wear some other clothing, thinking, well, this is really me. But was it? It wasn't me at all. It was just something I had chosen to be a little bit sloppy in my demeanor, a little bit careless in my dress, thinking that's me. It wasn't me at all. And all of us, to some degree, we think this is who I am outwardly. But from where have we taken those attitudes? From where have we taken those habits? From where have we taken those identifications of who we think we are? They're not us. They're just things that we've taken from our environment, we've picked up from social situations, from our friends, from some false identification. You could say one is no more true than the other, but yet one, you could say, is more true than the other. To smile is being more true than to be angry, because it's moving us in the direction of who and what we really are. And we're not just neutral beings. We're actually deep within ourselves on the soul level. We are something more. We're, as Swami Shankara said many years ago, centuries ago, he said, we're Sat Chitananda. That is our true nature. Our true nature is bliss. And that bliss expands, that bliss expresses itself in certain ways. And those ways it expresses outwardly, some of those ways are more in tune with who and what we really are, more inducive of that state than others. And so consequently, if we behave in a certain way that's more in tune with that deeper nature, we'll find that we begin to take on that deeper nature. We begin to, you might say, remove some of the dust and dirt that is obscuring that light of who we really are from shining forth. And we eventually, of course, the benefit accrues to us. We begin to feel that bliss. But when we associate and attune ourselves to those things that obscure that inner light, then we find that we suffer. And because it's not that God punishes us, but suffering, you could say, is just an absence of light. When there's less light, we don't enjoy life to the degree that when there is that light. And so consequently, everything we do in life has an effect. We can change our consciousness by our outer behavior. We can change our consciousness by how we act in life, what we think in life, what those things that over which we have some self-control. We can make choices, in other words. And the whole path of meditation, of the spiritual path, is learning to develop that ability to make conscious, wise, discriminative choices in life. And to the degree that we have an ability to make choices, we can then make wise choices. Now, unfortunately, most people have little ability to make choices, very little control of their life, and they make their decisions based upon the environment that they are in other words, they allow the environment, they allow life itself to dictate their choices, their attitudes, their behavior, instead of taking control of their life. And this is what it means, truly, to be a master. A master is someone who is in control of their life, who is not being directed simply by outward karmic forces. And so we can. So what Krishna, you could say, here is in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is like a wise guide for Arjuna. He's someone who has gone forward along the path ahead of the disciple. And he says, act this way, do this, be this way. Even though maybe you don't understand why right now, better to understand why you're doing it, so you're cooperating with it. But even if you don't, be this way, do this, and do that. And you'll find that by aligning yourself naturally with the natural upward flow of how energy wants to move in this world, you'll find yourself slowly attracting those forces that will support you, and you'll begin to be, you might say, harmonize with them, and your understanding will come. You'll, just as Paramahansa Yogananda used to say, that thoughts are not individually created, but they're universally received. And so we are like a radio station in the old days when you had such knobs to dial from one station to another. We are tuning our radio to be able to receive certain impressions, certain thoughts, certain stations, you might say, on the radio. So what we do outwardly attunes ourselves to life and to the universal consciousness of thought, and we begin to take on those, and we begin to leave the other behind. And we saw that wasn't me at all, and we begin to associate with that, something higher. Now that may not be you as either. You're something deeper, yet it perhaps is closer, moving you in that direction. I may have said this before, one of the earlier lessons, but I remember that story of the hunter who he catches birds, and he's hunting for birds, and he goes to the lake where many of the birds would come down to the water's edge, and he sees there a sannyasi bathing in the water. And the sannyasis, they're very, very calm, joyful, but he's bathing. And as he's bathing, and he's got his geru robes, and the birds come and they land on him. And the birds, and they're swimming right there beside him very peacefully, and some landing on his shoulders. And he's bathing there. And the hunter, seeing this, says, look at that. That gives me an idea. And so the hunter went and he bought himself some robes and the proper color to look like sannyasi. And he dressed himself as such, and the next day he went down to the water's edge, and he said, now I'll be just like the sannyasi, and the birds will come, and I'll be able to catch them, and I'll be able to be successful hunting. And so he went down to the water's edge, and sure enough, the birds began to come, and they began to swim close to him, and then the birds, some landed on his shoulders. And he was thinking and watching this happen, and the thought occurred to him. He says, just by mimicking, just by behaving like that sannyasi, look how the birds have come to me. And the thought crossed his mind, what if I was really like that sannyasi? If I really thought like that sannyasi? If I really had the inner consciousness of that sannyasi, how much better it would even be. Because he's seeing all this happening around him, and the birds trusting him, his heart was touched, and he began to look more deeply within himself, and he said, why couldn't I be this way rather than just acting this way? And so it starts with us. We sit to meditate, and our mind is restless. We sit to do spiritual practices, and we're thinking, I'm not a real yogi. I'm just pretending to be a yogi, trying to do this, but yet we sit straight and we look up the spiritual eye and we do everything proper and we've prepared ourselves in our asana and so forth. And maybe we feel that we're just fooling people. And maybe we think we're fooling ourselves. But no. If you approach life sincerely, you're sincerely trying to change. You're not trying to fool anybody. You're just trying to convince, other than not fool, but you're trying to convince yourself. And we approach life in this way. We approach our meditation this way. We approach our spiritual practice this way. We act in a certain way, and little by little, we start to attune ourselves and open ourselves to that and align ourselves with a flow of divine grace. This is what really meditation, spiritual practice is. We don't create a state within ourselves. We don't do it. What we do is we attune ourselves. We turn that radio station so that we're in alignment and we invite grace, we invite different thoughts, different attitudes, different ways of behavior. We invite these into our life and they come into our life and all of a sudden we think differently. We begin to have some inner, perhaps a little experience within. Our attitude begins to change. And all of a sudden we say, yes, this is who I am. And we're in that flow. So Krishna advises, in one of the other stanzas, he advises Arjuna. He says, Arjuna, be thou a yogi. Now, yes, sometimes we have to act like the yogi first before we inwardly become that. But this is not false. This is moving in a positive direction. But the deeper principle is that everything we do outward in our life matters. We take responsibility because it affects what happens inside. And ultimately, also, it begins by repeated action. Begins to change. Just like putting our attention at the point between the eyebrows, the brain itself becomes stimulated. The brain itself will change. It'll grow. It'll facilitate whatever it is that we're trying to learn or do. And so it is the body cells themselves. If we use our will, that God-given will, to behave in a certain way and make proper choices, the body itself will begin to align and cooperate with us. And then the world itself, outside of ourselves, will cooperate with us. So it matters what we do. And we can begin to change inwardly in this way. And then as we change inwardly, we outwardly also begin to express. And so you can see the inner and the outer, they're not separate. They're related. And we have to be responsible for both. Not to fool anybody else. But to convince ourselves, if anybody, and to align ourselves and to harmonize ourselves with that divine flow of grace. Many blessings.